We will turn to some additional partners, and let me welcome Helena Sims from AGA, Steve Daniels from the Department of Labor, and Matt Hammoudeh from the state of Illinois. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And this is, I think, just to kind of turn the page from internal controls and some of the real accountability measures in the guidance, turning more now to some of the administrative flexibilities that were provided. And particularly, we know that there's a whole section up front around exceptions to the guidance, and that section in particular flags OMB Memorandum M1317, which provides opportunities for waivers based on innovative program designs that may be proposed by federal awarding agencies. Along with that language, there's also language in the section on what's fondly known as time and effort reporting, but officially known as 200.430 compensation for personal services, which again provides an opportunity for waivers with federal awarding agency approval for blended and braided funding. And so I wonder if states have any questions about this, and let me turn it over to Matt to see if this is something you guys have wondered about.
It absolutely is, and thank you very much, Victoria. And with the current state of affairs in Illinois, and I believe in many states, financial pressures are prompting us to be more creative or think about how we could better utilize our funding and use new innovative strategies to finance ultimate outcomes that all of our grants seek to accomplish. And with that being said, I understand that the new guidance offers some guidance and some guidelines as to where innovative financing can be used.
Yeah, Matt, it really does. Hello, I'm Steve Daniels. I'm the Director of the Division of Policy Review and Resolution at the Department of Labor. At the Department of Labor, we're a COFAR member and have a large formula mandatory grant program as well as an expansive discretionary grant program. And Matt, having actually worked on the uniform guidance, I've got some really great news for you. It's encouraging that the uniform guidance really does explicitly say, we'd like to encourage you to start thinking about a little bit more about performance over compliance, while still, of course, being accountable for the federal dollars. We're looking to achieve more efficiencies for combined outcomes. The uniform guidance really talks about innovation and really pushing the envelope forward. Of course, we got to be accountable for the federal dollar. And of course, there's got to be some outcomes at the very end and some performance metrics along the way. The great news, as Victoria's mentioned, is the guidance has this authority for blended funding. And that's in section 200.430. The bad news is if you want to do something today, you got to go somewhere else. And I think if you were to look at M13-17, you're going to find some relief and some authorities there. What's great about M13-17 is it really does encourage innovation, experimentation, and for us to test new approaches. So when we were thinking about trying to do some blended funding, looking at the uniform guidance, which isn't in effect yet, we thought, let's look at M13-17, which does provide some authorities. We want to talk about innovative, outcome-focused initiatives where we can blend funds in exchange for greater accountability for the outcomes on the other end. So if we want to reduce some of our compliance areas, or we wanted to try to not to be accountable for every single dollar that's expended against specific funding streams, then the guidance is saying you've got to have some very firm outcomes on the back end. And I think that's important also. That guidance, M13-17, also talks about having a very rigorous evaluation process as you complete your work, because what we're trying to do is to streamline, be innovative, and be outcome-focused as it relates to the federal dollar. At the Department of Labor, we had a recipient approach us and said, geez, we've got multiple funding streams, we've got multiple programs, federal programs, with a lot of common objectives and outcomes and goals. What can we do? We said, Matt, I said, yeah, I tried this braided funding thing. This is a great idea. You take these multiple funding streams and you braid them together and see what happens. So we worked that with our recipient. About 3 months later, they came back and said, we tried that blended funding thing. Didn't save us a penny. we were still accountable to each one of those individual funding streams against their specific performance outcomes, we didn't save a dime. In fact, it was labor intensive. What else can we do? Oh, and Steve, you had mentioned to us in the past this new concept that's in the uniform guidance called blended funding. So we worked with our recipient, and it took many meetings and discussions. And what we ended up doing is developing a concept paper, a proposal, which we in turn made to OMB, Victoria and Gill, in fact. Our blended funding proposal that we put together combines 3 federal agencies, 6 federal funding streams across 5 state agencies. A complex program, but we kept some of the basic things in mind as it relates to the uniform guidance in M13-17. And that was, how do we remain accountable to the federal dollar, but really focus on the outcomes, because that's what the new uniform guidance is saying. That's what M13-17 is saying, is give us the outcomes, remain accountable for the dollar, and tell me about how you're going to evaluate how your program went. So we developed our program, and it also involved a couple of waivers and deviations, which is okay under the uniform guidance. As we looked at our program, in order not to be so specifically accountable for every penny spent across that specific funding stream and those performance outcomes, we're going to need to have a couple of waivers. And that's under our common rule for the standards for financial management systems, as well as for financial reporting. We really focused on our metrics. We focused on our outcomes. What we in the state agreed to do, our recipient, and our proposal was to take a look at the funding that we've spent on a monthly basis. Where do we stand against the performance outcomes, but what are our milestones along the way, understanding we got a little bit of startup time involved. We think we've put together a pretty strong program. And under our blended proposal, all the funds get mixed in together, which makes accounting and apportioning the various dollars back out to the 6 funding streams extraordinarily important, as well as the specific performance metrics and outcomes for the Department of Labor, which I'm extremely interested in, and the other 2 federal agencies that are involved. So it's a complex program. We certainly at the Department of Labor don't have all the answers. We've got a little bit of experience as it relates to studying the guidance, drafting a concept paper, presenting it to OMB for their feedback and responses. And we've got some great feedback and responses. Actually, Matt, I wished I had known Helena prior to submitting the paper, because AGA has developed some tools and has some experience. With that, I'd like to ask Helena about some of her experience in the toolkit.
Well, I'll be happy to do that, Steve. And it was interesting. You and I really haven't talked much before this. And so many of the themes you talked about are themes that we have picked up in the work that we've done on this. I am Helena Sims. I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the Association of Government Accountants. And the reason that I've been asked to be here today is we're working on a guide for braided and blended funding. I'd like to explain a little bit about, when I say we, who I mean. AGA, back a few years ago, created an intergovernmental partnership, and the reason that we did that is the Association of Government Accountants members are federal, state, and local. And we were interested in opening the doors for communication between the different levels of government. What we wanted to do was to figure out the administrative problems that exist between the levels of government, and see if we couldn't come up with practical guides to overcoming these programs. Now, in terms of why our intergovernmental partnership picked blended and braided funding, it goes back to an OMB initiative several years ago, or maybe it was only a couple of years ago, Victoria, when OMB was putting together a work group of people in the summer to work on the executive order on flexibility. And there were a number of issues that we talked about during that session. OMB brought people together from across the country on phone calls to talk about how can we increase flexibility? And of course, being with the Association of Government Accountants, one of the things we're interested in is not only how do you increase flexibility, but how do you maintain accountability? So that was a theme that summer in terms of flexibility. We were interested in accountability. And one of the recommendations that came out of that group was to pursue blended and braided funding. And one of the things that we did was we looked at some programs that the Environmental Protection Agency has in place, as well as the U.S. Department of Education. And I can talk a little bit about those, but I don't want to spend too much time. Also during that summer, there was a problem in Orlando with homeless children, and 60 Minutes focused a lot on that you had these children who were living in campers and trailers. And what occurred to some of us who were working with OMB on the flexibility initiative is, gee, you have homeless children. Look at all of the different funding sources, the different programs that could be used to help them. You have education, you have health care, you have housing, and other human service agencies. It's really important when you want to solve a problem in a holistic manner that you be able to combine funding from different sources. So we set out to find out what has already happened in this area, and based on that, what are things that we can see as common good practices, best practices? In terms of the Department of Education, they have a program called school-wide programs. And this is for schools that receive Title I, which is for low-income programs. What they want to do with a school-wide program, and this is legislatively authorized, is to address children that are in low-income schools to try to raise their performance up in a holistic manner. And the way they do that was a common theme that I heard you talk about and that we've heard others talk about. You get the stakeholders together. In this case, it's the parents and the students. Now, if you're talking elementary school, I'm not sure how you do that with students, but anyhow, and other stakeholders in the community that are working to improve the education of children. And you get them around a table and you develop a plan. First of all, you assess the needs. You get all the stakeholders together. You develop a plan like you've done for solving the problem. And then, and this is key, in the accountability area, what you do is the auditors audit against that plan. Rather than auditing a bunch of compliance requirements that stack on top of each other with each program that comes in, what you do is you decide up front what your goals are, how you're going to accomplish it, what the activities are that will demonstrate that you've reached your outcomes, and then you audit against those outcomes rather than all of those compliance requirements. So the common themes that we saw were you do a needs assessment, you convene the stakeholders, you develop a plan, and you audit against the plan. There's a similar program in EPA that is also statutorily authorized, and they have authorized, the secretary under legislative authority has said, okay, there are 17 programs under EPA that we can combine the funds for in a blended manner. It can deal with water. It can deal with hazardous substances. It can deal with air quality. It's given them great flexibility after tornadoes and floods and hurricanes to go in and shift money around between those different siloed programs to address emergency situations. So we were very encouraged by what we found, and we determined that there are mechanisms for assuring accountability when you increase flexibility.
Well, that's great. And you know, you mentioned a couple things about accountability, and it's great to hear the focus on outcomes and the ultimate goal of those grants. But how does this affect subrecipient monitoring?
Well, gee, that's a great question, and we certainly do know from Section 200.101 that the terms and conditions of award to the prime recipient are going to flow down to our subrecipient. I've got some more good news for you, too, as it relates to some flexibilities and some other things that you can do. There is something called the fixed amount award, and that's defined in Section 200.45. In 200.332, it does allow us to make fixed amount awards with our subrecipients. Now, that does require prior approval in order to do that, which means we're going to need to go back and get approval. And it also is limited to the small acquisition threshold. So there is a financial dollar cap on the amount we can do there. But there is some possibility and there is flexibility for actually executing some subawards with some of these new flexibilities. And I think you're going to really enjoy that.
That's great.
Now, as we've looked at the programs and as Helen's talked about it, there are going to be some potential issues, some things that you might want to think about as you develop your plan, Matt. And some of the key questions that we really struggled with in terms of our metrics and measuring oversight and monitoring is the funding piece. How do we fund as we blend? Are we going to dump all of that particular appropriation, that award amount, into our blended funding kettle? Or are we going to apportion those particular dollars based on those dollars apportionment against outcomes? Are they going to be based more upon the specific metrics and outcomes for those individual funding streams? And then importantly, too, and a question that OMB had asked us is, how are you going to prove it? How are you going to validate that? How are you going to measure that along the way? So those are questions that we've struggled with in terms of putting the appropriate answers to. The performance metrics also are keenly important to us. We know what our final outcome is, but as we proceed through the life of this blended funding program, how are we going to measure our progress along the way? For the Department of Labor in a particular training program, we're not going to have measurement of particular students who have graduated until that semester or that training program is concluded. That could be a semester, that could be a year away. So how do we measure that along the way? There could also be gainful employment metrics. I'm not going to be able to measure that for a year or 6 months after the student has graduated and completed their work. And those are inherent parts of our particular authorizing statutes. A critical piece, and Helen's kind of touched on this, is A133 audits. The auditor comes in, and now we've blended all of these funds into one big bucket, and we're now saying the end game is the most important thing because we're now going to be talking about performance over compliance. Well, what's the poor recipient supposed to have in their folder when the auditor comes in and says, I don't get this blended funding thing, you got this bucket full of money here from multiple agencies, what's going on? And I think Ellen's point in her toolkit about having this plan from which we're going to monitor, in addition to the waivers, the deviations we're going to establish ahead of the plan, those are going to be keenly important for our A133 auditors. So we need to have that taken care of. How do we oversee this program? How do we take a look along the way in relationship with the performance metrics that we've outlined? If the ultimate outcome is training and graduating students and gaining employment, and that's a ways down the road, how do I measure that along the way? I know that we want to have monthly checks in the program we've designed, but I don't have anything I can wrap my hands around and tell you, yes, we've graduated so many students or we've gainfully employed so many individuals. We kind of think that as we take a look at the whole process, that we're going to be evolving, and the first pilot program that we run isn't going to have all the answers. We're probably going to stub our toe a little bit. We're going to learn a little bit along the way. I think most importantly is the rigorous evaluation that's being required under M13-17 as well as the uniform guidance. And we've put in conjunction with our recipient a very rigorous third-party evaluation to tell us the hard facts of what went right, what went wrong, so that the next time we want to do a program, we're going to be able to hit the nail on the head or at least get a little bit closer so I'm not smacking my thumb every time I strike the hammer. We believe importantly at the Department of Labor and in our discussions with OMB that the process is going to be evolutionary in nature. We're not going to hit a home run the first time we swing the bat, but we believe over time as we work vigorously towards the goals and objectives of the uniform guidance, as well as what's outlined in M13-17, that, yeah, there are some tremendous efficiencies to be had. We got to dot some I's and cross the T's along the way, and we're going to make some mistakes along the way, but I think the overall intent is really fantastic. And this is great news, I think, for all of our recipients at state, as well as our recipients from discretionary awards.
Absolutely. It's very exciting.
Okay.
Well, I forgot to mention something that is probably pretty important, and that is the guide that we're working on will be available free online. It should be finished later this month. And for those of you who would like to get a copy of it, you can just Google Association of Government Accountants, and when you get to our website, you'll be able to find the report. So I just thought it was important to mention that as well. I don't know how we're doing on time, but
Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you. I think this has been an excellent discussion.